dig into them and see really clearly where things have changed or not changed over the years. So I hope you find the report useful. The purpose of the report is really to reflect on where we are and where we need to go. This is a pivotal moment for all of us. We're 18 months into the current mandate and 18 months to go in the next election. And in that context, the report is part of building momentum for change, but momentum for change now. Priorities as we look forward to the next programme for government 18 months plus from now. So essentially the report does three things. It is an overview of the state of play. What's the state of poverty in Northern Ireland? Where are we now? And what you'll hear today is really familiar to many of you in the room and to many of you online. We're taking this year a closer look at in-work poverty because the majority of people living in poverty now are in working households. And equally important, the report attempts to set out some ways forward. So we start to look at options that would shift the dial. And we're going to be having the opportunity in Q&A, and then for those of you in the room to really dig into that when we move into the discussion session. And your thoughts and your insights are really crucial in that. But it's really important. And I think at this moment, particularly in December, we all tend to turn our thoughts to the new year, what we hope for that. And one of the things we're trying to do in this report is to consider what better would look like in the new year. It is, I hope, whilst it may be sometimes discouraging reading, I hope there's grounds for optimism in the report, and I'll say more about that. So what's going to happen today is I'm going to invite our senior analyst, Christine, to run through the main findings of the report with you. We are, and it's important to say this, especially grateful to all of the people who shared their direct experience with us, because I think that brings a particular perspective and a real richness to the hard data that you'll find in the report. And I'm not going to steal Christine's thunder, far from it. But what I will say is that you'll hear that children continue to bear the brunt of poverty in Northern Ireland. You'll hear that escalating housing costs are a real concern, and Kate will speak to that when we move to the panel. You'll hear that for far too many people, work is not working, and Christine will explain more. So we know we need to focus on long-term change. We need to focus that change on housing. We need to focus that change in the labour market. We need to make sure that it is easier for people to get into and sustain good jobs where they are able to harness their own skills and potential and create a better life. And critically, we also need to make sure, because underpinning all of that is the need for a social security system that does what it says on the tin, that delivers the security people need when they need it the most. So the social security system has to be there to do its job, and we need investment in the social security system. It's, I think, sometimes really tempting to doubt that change is possible, sometimes to despair. And I think now more than ever, it's really important to remain optimistic. And I think there are reasons to be optimistic, despite the scale of the challenge that you'll see in the report, and despite the multifaceted and sometimes complex nature of the responses that are required. But it would be far too easy just to put fixing poverty in the too hard to fix box, and it's not. So I think we do need to stay optimistic. I know all of you will have welcomed the decision to lift the long overdue decision to lift the 2-child limit last week. That will make... I didn't do it. We'd have done it. We'd never put it in place in the first place. That's really important. It will make a meaningful difference to children in Northern Ireland. But that's not the whole story. That's not the end game. And I think it's really important to remember that the executive has in the past shown its determination to protect people in Northern Ireland from the harshest impact of social security cuts. And many of you in this room were absolutely instrumental to lobbying for the welfare reform mitigations that have been in place now for some time. Recently, with the recent recommitment at the end of last year. And it's important to remember, and I think they tell us what's possible. They have made a difference. They continue to make a difference. And right now, for the first time in over a decade, we do have a programme for government. Mm-hmm. And we do have a multi-year budget settlement. So this is the time for politicians to seize the moment. In the new year, the final version of the anti-poverty strategy, I hope, will be published. We don't need to rehearse the arguments in the room this morning. We may well later, but I'm not going to do it right now. I don't have time about the current draft. But that matters because that's what's going to set the agenda for the next 10 years. And it's really important in setting that agenda that the executive sets targets that it will hold itself accountable for, that it's willing to say we will be accountable for this. And in thinking then, finally, about what the executive can do, in addition to making itself accountable for the change it wants to see, for the change we all want to see, I think our message today is that we've been stuck for too long and the executive needs to pick up the pace. That is picking up the pace on those structural changes. I've talked about housing, and you'll hear more about that, housing, the labour market, and the social security system. And our big message is that for as long as 1 in 4 of our children are growing up in poverty in Northern Ireland, we cannot afford to wait for long-term change. So you'll hear us speak about the potential transformative effect of a targeted child payment in Northern Ireland focused on low-income households. None of that will happen without whole executive commitment, but we are asking them to urgently look at that because we know that will make a difference to 150,000 kids in 80,000 households. That's a change that can happen fast, and it's the right investment in our future because the status quo is not an option. The longer we wait to move on this, the next generation of kids will find themselves in the same cycle. So it's time to break this cycle. The outcomes for kids right now are poor. For children living in poverty, the outcomes are poor. But we all pay a price for that. So this is a moment for change. I'm determined to stay stubbornly optimistic as we move into the new year. This is a moment for change. I hope the report today is useful for you. I hope it adds to the weight of the momentum in the work that you're all doing to deliver that better future. So I'm going to pass to Christine to get stuck into the key findings of the report. And then I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panellists. We are joined this morning by Gertie Horgan from the University of Ulster and member of the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network, Lisa McDowell from the Employment Rights Unit at the Law Centre, and Kate McCauley, Chief Exec of Housing Rights. Christine will also be staying with us on the panel, and I'll look forward to that conversation in due course. But right now, a big welcome to all of you online, and let's get stuck into the report. Thank you.
Hey, well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the launch of this report today. As Ursula said, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the key messages, really looking at what the evidence says about where the problems are and what we can do about that. The first part of the report is really focused on providing an overview of trends in poverty in Northern Ireland and looks at who in our society is bearing the brunt of that hardship. Then the remainder of the report really gets into a lot of detail about this challenge that we have of in-work poverty, really challenging this narrative that work ensures, a warm house, food on the table, clothes and toiletries for everyone. Our evidence says that promise has been broken for a large proportion of families in Northern Ireland. So, no. I know how to do that, Wes. Okay, you can see it. All right, so yeah, starting with the overall trends in poverty, you can see that for about 15 years, there was a very gradual decline in the rates of poverty here. It went down by about 3 percentage points. But since just before the pandemic, the last 5 years or so, it's completely flatlined. You see all of the lines just start to really flatten out. Okay, that's our story of stagnation, of stalling, of really being stuck. And that is for poverty, deep poverty, and very deep poverty. No progress on any of those. In terms of the scale of the challenge, 330,000 people across Northern Ireland can't afford what they need. Now, that's 17% of our population. It's about the size of the population of the city of Belfast in our country are struggling. Included in that, there are 110,000 children growing up in poverty. And in other words, that's a quarter, or as Ursula said, 1 in 4 of our children here who are being overlooked rather than us investing in the people that are really going to shape the future of our society. It's not only the depth of poverty that matters, but how long you're stuck in that poverty for. Persistent poverty can have the most damaging effects. And here, 1 in 10 people are living in persistent poverty, meaning that they have been, stuck below that poverty line for 3 out of the last 4 years. Now, I think most of us in this room, unfortunately, know that the risks aren't evenly distributed across Northern Ireland. You'll see here the rates of poverty in the kind of west and northwest, and Derry City and Strabane, Fermanagh and Omagh are higher, whereas they tend to be around Belfast, and the eastern part of Northern Ireland tend to be lower. A little bit of caution though, because these percentages themselves kind of mask a lot of variation within them. If we take, for example, Belfast City, a poverty rate of 15%, we know that there are some very affluent areas of Belfast right next to some very, areas of real deprivation. Belfast West has the highest rate of child poverty. 1 in 3 children there are growing up in poverty. Now, there's also certain groups in our society that are bearing the brunt of this disadvantage, and I'm going to be saying a lot of numbers, but I think it's really important to try and keep in mind the fact that our overall poverty rates are 17%, which is a lot lower than any of these numbers that I'm going to say. So 4 in 10 lone parent families, 40%, face hardship. A third of large families can't afford what they need. Again, 4 in 10 full-time carers are struggling to cover the essentials, and over a third of working age disabled adults are in poverty. So you can see their real concentrated risk. Finally, there is a very real and unfair issue with data disaggregated by ethnicity. And it's not not a new issue. The most recent figures indicate that 26% of individuals from ethnic minority backgrounds are in poverty, compared to 17% of white individuals. While this kind of shows that there is an inequality, we have to really treat those numbers with a lot of caution. There's a lot of issues to do with the underlying data that really make it hard to draw any conclusions, but also it tells us nothing about, the scale or the causes of that disparity. That in itself, it's a fundamental evidence gap. It's an inequality in and of itself. We can analyse poverty in detail for the white population, but we can't do that for the ethnic minority groups in Northern Ireland. The report then has also uncovered a few real warning signs that we need to really pay attention to. Firstly is the fact that in Northern Ireland here we have a very high level of financial vulnerability. So nearly half of all adults in Northern Ireland have less than £1,500 in savings, but those in very deep poverty, 1 in 3 have absolutely no savings at all. So there's nothing to fall back on. The second red flag is in housing. Housing costs have kind of traditionally been seen as a bit of a protective factor for us in Northern Ireland. But yeah, the red flags are kind of flying here. Since the early 2000s, the number of people living in the private rental sector has doubled, and the number of those in poverty within this group has increased by over 60%. And 3 in 10 private renters now face poverty. So those are the headline figures and, the warning signs that show us where the problems lie. The remainder, as I said, we're going to focus in more on that in-work poverty challenge. I guess the thing is, many of us, it's very ingrained, the story of work is the route out of poverty and will protect us. And the key thing is that the evidence does not suggest that. The report really challenges that idea. The reality is that the majority of people in Northern Ireland now live in working households. So 70,000 or 6 in 10 children in poverty in Northern Ireland now are in households where at least one adult works. To understand things a little bit better, the report then looked at issues of low pay, of hours worked, and the key industry sectors where these kind of problems are concentrated. On the pay issue, we find that it is a really, really widespread challenge. Taking the real living wage as the benchmark for an acceptable wage, 45% of all workers were paid below that benchmark for at least one of the last 5 years. I mean, that means that only 55% of workers here in Northern Ireland are consistently being paid above the real living wage. So it's really not a marginal issue that just affects like a small portion of our society. It's widespread. Going into that analysis of low pay a little bit further, then there are some areas of movement. So you'll see the 55% of those that are consistently paid above the real living wage. We have 21% that have gone from being paid above the real living wage to being paid below it. So the movement's in the wrong direction, really. And only 2% have managed to escape low pay. We also then have this kind of persistent, the green bar along the bottom of 13% of people that were paid under that benchmark for at least 4 out of the 5 years. So really persistently in that low paid category. There's also an hours problem, and the data that shows us that all adults in the household really now do need to work in order to stay afloat, which, bear in mind that is not always possible for everyone, and also makes certain groups like lone parent families particularly at risk. This chart shows that the poverty rate for households where all adults are in work is 7% compared to 21% where at least one, but not all adults are working. And we see that contrast even more pronounced for children, with poverty affecting 12% of those in households where all adults are working, and more than 3 times that rate at 38%, where only one adult works. So that really reflects this challenge that very few families can always fit into that standard year-round full-time employment model, especially without, support systems in place, which really aren't there for many, many people. Now we go on to look at the industries where these issues are most prevalent in Northern Ireland. And the industry with the highest poverty rate here is agriculture. Nearly 1 in 4 families who have a member of the household in agriculture are in poverty. Unfortunately, we just don't have the decent sample sizes to really get into that and do justice to those issues that are being faced within that industry. But it's important to say that is an issue with data. That is not a denial that the people in those industries are facing some real challenges. Following that, then around 18% of people with a family member who works in the arts or in retail are in poverty, while 15% of those with someone employed in hospitality were affected. 22% of all people in poverty also work in health and social work. So in the report, we focus on those 4 sectors: arts, retail, hospitality, and health and social work, as that's where the data tells us those problems are really concentrated. I would really encourage you to read, the report. It's here. If you scan it, it brings you directly to, the web page. But there's a lot of detail there about the kind of industry-specific challenges that people are facing, including barriers to progression in health and social work, not enough hours in retail, or hours that change week by week, the need for multi-jobbing for people who are working in the arts, and again, low pay and not enough hours, often within hospitality. But just to highlight some kind of key headline messages, if we look at the proportion of jobs that are low paid, the rates are really, really shockingly high. I mean, low pay affects 83% of hospitality workers and 70% of those in retail. Again, if we think about this hours issue, this graph looks at contract type for all workers and low paid workers in the different industries. Over half of those in hospitality are on part-time contracts, rising to 6 and 10 for the low paid workers in hospitality. We also commissioned some interviews then, as Ursula had mentioned, to really try and ground this data and understand how it is affecting people in their everyday lives. And it was the interviews that really showed us those kind of structural barriers to working, especially working the hours that people are needing to work in order to survive. Unfortunately, probably not a surprise to anyone. Entirely predictable, but everybody was talking about childcare. That's the most common thing. It's expensive. We don't have the same access to free childcare here as they do in other parts of the UK. It's inflexible, doesn't work, with the realities of the working day. Those who require out-of-the-box childcare, if their kid has additional needs, are finding it really, really difficult to find a fit, especially rural areas. That came out quite strongly. Childcare is a really key structural bottleneck, which is why we're going to be looking at it in more depth in the new year and options for reform. The interviews also then underscored the real difficulties in supporting disabled people into work and showed that carers in particular require flexibility, that it's not possible the way that our kind of work is set up, a lot of the time. So one full-time worker explained while her employer might be accommodating of any requests to reduce her hours or to change her hours, that would just result in her receiving less money. So although, she needed flexibility, and it was theoretically possible. It wasn't feasible for her. It's totally impractical. Finally, then, it's clear that our local labour markets, there's also an issue there, and it's not kind of meeting people where they're at. This graph shows the proportion of advertised jobs that say they are disability confident or flexible or remote working or hybrid. The interviews really brought out how important remote working was to many people, especially in rural communities across Northern Ireland. But when you look at this analysis of the jobs advertised showing opportunities that were hybrid or remote, I mean, it's very, very rare across the board. And where it does happen, it's very much concentrated in the urban areas of Belfast and Derry, Londonderry. So just 0.6% of jobs in Causeway Coasting Glens, 1% in Mid and East Antrim, and 2% in Armagh were advertised as remote, compared to 5% in Belfast, which is still small, but significantly more than 0.6%. Similarly, the proportion of jobs advertised as disability friendly, again, very low across the board in Northern Ireland. Where it does happen, it's in the urban areas. So what can we do? We modelled 3 scenarios. Firstly, the evidence shows that children in Northern Ireland are the group of our population that are most affected by poverty. So this first scenario that we modelled was the introduction of a targeted child payment, much like what they've done in Scotland. This would mean a payment of £28 per week per child to ensure they're given the right start in life. Secondly, because we identified this real issue of low pay in Northern Ireland and how widespread it is, we've modelled the impact of raising all wages to above the real living wage. The third option then was, recognising that the causes of child poverty are multifaceted and might require kind of multi-pronged approach, was to model the impact of doing both those things, the targeted child payment and raising wages above the real living wage. So you'll see the results here in the table. Surprising perhaps, but raising wages alone has a very minimal effect, reducing child poverty by 1%. But a child payment delivers a more significant drop, cutting overall child poverty to 20%, benefiting 150,000 children in 80,000 households across Northern Ireland. And it's families in the lowest income group that would gain the most, about £2,800 a year. So our core recommendation is that the executive should immediately consider the introduction of a targeted child payment. Broader structural reform, as highlighted in this report, it is really, really needed, including, wage reform, including employment options for carers and those with disabilities who are able to work. But those reforms take considerable time and can't be expected to turn things around quickly for the unacceptable amount of children and families who are really, really struggling and facing hardship right now in Northern Ireland. A targeted child payment would give households breathing space now and give time for broader reforms to take place. Finally, I'll close with a quote from a single father of 2, illustrating the immediate impact this change would have on his family's life.
Thanks, Christine. So thank you, Christine. That really is a whistle-stop tour of the report. So do please dig into it. There's a lot of data in there. There's a lot of information in there that we really hope you'll take away and digest and then do something with it. So I'm going to now turn to our panel discussion. For this, I'm going to go back and sit down and we'll get stuck in. We're going to, first of all, hear from our panelists and then we'll take some Q&A in the room, and very conscious that we're joined by a large number of people online. We'll also try and make sure that we get some questions coming in online. Okay, so So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Freddie, if I can start with you. I wondered, I'll ask kind of everybody the same question first. Sheena gets a breather for a minute, or sorry, Christine gets a breather for a moment. And it is, to what extent does the report chime with what you're saying? And particularly, Grady, if I can ask you just to take that overview. But you've a lot of experience in anti-poverty work, both as an academic and now with the Anti-Poverty Network, the Northern Ireland Anti-Poverty Network. What's your sense of whether the report chimes with your assessment of where we are and what NIPAN see in its work?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, there's no surprises really in the report. I think all of us would have expected the kind of outcomes that we've seen in it, the in-work, it's really good that you've got the concentration on in-work poverty, because we've seen, as Christine said, this narrative that if only everybody was in work, well, then everything would be okay. And the reality is, as is pointed out in the report, that here in Northern Ireland, our median income is actually less than what it is in Britain. And then, of course, west of the ban. And I always advocate for west of the ban. It's about £3,000 a year less again than it is in the Northern Ireland average. So really, in-work poverty is a huge issue. And I really want to, and this is something that our lived panel, lived experience panel people would talk about, NIPAN, is the cost of working. So if you remember, those of you who were around at the time when Eileen Evison did her report for the mitigations, what became the mitigations of welfare reform, she was really clear that actually the costs of working here in Northern Ireland are greater than they are in England, Scotland or Wales. Public transport is a massive part of that. And I noticed even in the essentials sort of ideas that you had with Trussell, that the cost of transport here is costed in at the exact same as it is in England, Scotland and Wales, despite the fact that actually we have a really low level of subsidy of public transport and no public transport at all in some places. My colleagues at UU are fed up with me saying the last train to Derry leaves at 9:15. And that really sort of limits things. If you live in Derry, and 1 in 10 people in Derry travel to Belfast every day for work, you either get a train at 6:10 to get here for 9 o'clock, or you don't get here for 9 o'clock. So that's the kind of constraints that are faced, and that's just the cost of travel. Childcare, we know, I mean, you need a second mortgage, don't you, for the childcare. So like the costs of working are something that I think we need to be talking about more, because of the narrative that what we all need to do is to get into work. So it very much chimes with what we've been saying. The one thing that I do think we need to talk about more as well is actually the narrative that there's a lot of benefit fraud. And the idea that on the one hand, politicians accept that the benefit system doesn't give people the essentials that they need. And on the other hand, saying that we need to fight fraud. Because I used to say, when I was lecturing on poverty, I used to say, anybody who thinks that you can live on benefits, anybody who, condemns people who do the double or, get a bit of, do an extra nick certain weekend or something, you get a bit of extra money, then really, in a way, if you are not doing that, then it means, if you've got children, they're either going hungry at times or they're going cold at times, because that's how poor the benefit system is. And yet, what are our politicians concentrating on? They're concentrating on small amounts of fraud, tiny amounts of money. When you look at the overall waste of storage, I mean, it's really hard not to, when you hear that $500,000 was spent on a new canteen, on doing up the canteen. Anyway, that was just this morning's news. So I guess I would just sort of say as well that we actually need to sort of seriously talk to the politicians about, why is there this concentration on fraud when there's this, as we have. I mean, I can go back to other stuff. I really want to talk about disability as well, but I think that.
Well, actually, take a moment now.
Okay.
And just speak into the disability piece. It's a really important and a non-surprising finding in the report that a third of people with a disability in Northern Ireland are living in poverty, and that's now an old story. So, I mean, this year we saw significant changes that were rolled back, significant changes that were proposed that were ultimately rolled back at Westminster. But there is much more to do in disability. So maybe just speak into that now.
Okay, so at the moment, across Northern Ireland, there's the move from ESA, the transition from ESA to universal credit is underway. And as part of that, the health element of universal credit has been cut in half. And nobody talks about it. It's like it's not happening. So that actually means an actual reduction to the amount of benefits that people who've been on ESA are going to get when they move to the universal credit. There's also the whole question of how complicated it is, frankly, to move from ESA to universal credit. My daughter, who's disabled, is in the middle of doing this. And I find that despite the fact that she has me as her appointee, she has a key worker and a social worker, we still haven't got her universal credit and housing element and all that sorted after like nearly 3 months. Now, how does that bode, for somebody who doesn't have the kind of resources like my daughter does? The other thing is there's the fact that cuts are happening to the incomes of people with disabilities, but there's also the attacks on disabled people, which are really like the narrative about disabled people across the UK, and the fact that it's allowed here in Northern Ireland when we know the reality of disability, when we know that because of the legacy of the conflict that we have far higher levels of mental ill health, that there's physical ill health as well, that people think that they can kind of say, oh, they're just pretending, or that somehow or other that there isn't the level of disability that there is really, really disgraceful. And as for getting disabled people into work, we know that most disabled people want to work. Of course they do. Most people want to work. But it's almost impossible. I mean, we've just talked about the difficulties of things like childcare and transport, etc. For the average worker. Well, for a disabled worker, and especially people who would need a lot of support. So we know that the evidence is really clear that the best way to get disabled people into work is to place them in a job and then train them and give them the support. Instead, what we're getting is this individual thing. Oh, you're not qualified enough. You're not trained enough. We'll bring you in and give you a course, do your course, and then just put you into the world of work where you've no hope of even getting an interview, frankly, no matter to say a job. So they're not using the evidence that we have to say, place and then train and support. And you just wonder, why do we produce this? I almost feel like this a bit, and I'm sure so does Chris, we all do, I think. You produce evidence to say, this is what would work. And it's like just completely ignored as something very differently done instead. And I think that for disabled people, they really must, at this stage, feel like they're just completely ignored and nobody really wants them to work. Because if they did, then actually we would have like a way of doing that. We would follow the evidence as to how you do it successfully.
So there is a disability and work strategy under consultation at the moment. And I know many of you in the room and many of you online will also be really actively engaged in that. It is an opportunity to bring that evidence to the fore. So just really encourage everyone to get involved in that process. Lisa, thank you, Goretti. Lisa, can I turn to you from the Employment Rights Unit at the Law Centre? So working really with people when they are struggling in the workplace. What does the report's findings about work resonate with what you see in your day-to-day work in the Employment Rights Unit?
Yeah, so certainly from the employment rights perspective, we really welcome the report, and it certainly highlights a number of issues that we see day in, day out really in the Employment Rights Unit. I think what's really important to highlight is that, as the report clearly states, there is this general assumption that if people are in work, they're not in poverty. And obviously the evidence is very clear that that's not the case. From our perspective, every person that comes to our service, everybody who we advise or assist or indeed represent, is either currently in work or up to very recently has been in work. And yet financial hardship continues to be a very significant issue for them, for most of them, or for many of them. So certainly I think that's where with the report highlighting that is really helpful to us. I think as well, it sort of begs the question that in theory, really being in work should be a ticket out of poverty. So we have to sort of, from an employment rights perspective, ask ourselves why is it not, what's not working? Certainly what we see would be a lot of issues with employment contracts, per contracts, 0 hours contracts, inappropriate use of 0 hours contracts. That's something that we see an awful lot of, and it's something that I think really needs to be challenged and looked at. Another issue that we're seeing, and we're actually seeing it more and more in recent times, is this issue with the 3-tier idea of the 3-tier employment status. So there's definitely blurred lines between particularly the employment status of an employee and a worker. And actually what we're seeing is a lot of people don't have any real understanding. There's a lack of transparency around what that actually means in practice.
Could you just say a little bit about what that does mean in practice?
Yeah, so essentially we have, I think, are moving towards making it a 2-tier employment status. So you'll have just employee and self-employed. But here we find there's a lot of issues in that we have the employee, the worker, and the self-employed. And where the lines are really blurred is between making that differentiation between an employee and a worker. So essentially, if you're a worker, you don't have the same statutory employment rights as an employee. But if you have someone on a 0 hours, working at 0 hours, quite often their employment status can actually be that of a worker, or certainly the employer is deeming them to be a worker. And if they come to us with issues around their employment, they're shocked to hear that actually they don't have the required employment status to allow them to have their statutory employment rights. So it's things like employment, or the work being terminated without notice. There's no entitlement to notice pay. There's no entitlement to redundancy. Sick pay is an issue. So I think that's something that really needs to be closely looked at, as to really, it's really sort of a bogus use of this 3-tier employment status.
And in relation to, Christine highlighted that the report really focuses on, what are essentially vital sectors, hospitality, retail, health and care. Is anything that you heard there a surprise to you?
No, it's not surprising, but I would say that we actually see these issues across the board. They're very far reaching, and I would say you would struggle to find a field or an industry where you don't see this, but certainly there's no surprise. Retail, I think 0 hours contracts in particular would be quite a common feature in retail. Agriculture, I don't think we see that just as much, but I think that probably comes from the seasonal workers issue there. But certainly we see a lot of issues with the health and care in that field, just in terms of actually agency workers who tend to be female, tend to have dependents. Quite often it affects migrant workers, so there's a dependency on their visa status comes with the employment. So there's no surprises that those fields, those areas are sort of the highest hit, but certainly I would say it is across the board.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. And you've mentioned something that's really important, and it does come out in the report, and that is the gendered nature of poverty. You see that woven throughout the report in terms of childcare, in terms of work. Children bear the brunt of poverty, and it's gendered. But Kate, if I can come to you next, Christine talked about red flag waving, so alarm signal really emitting here on housing. That's something I know that Housing Rights has been looking at and keeping a really close eye on for a long time. The housing environment has changed quite significantly over the last 20 years in particular. Just would welcome your reflections on what you see in the report and how that is reflective or not reflective of the work that you're up to at Housing Rights.
Thanks, Ursula. I think this report is really welcome, because whilst the idea that progress on poverty is stalled, it's also really helpful to show where things are escalating, where things are getting worse. And the terminology around red flag in particular is one that really resonates with me. There have been huge changes in the housing landscape over the last 20 years, but particularly post-pandemic and post the economic shocks, multiple economic shocks which have followed the pandemic. We talk a lot in Northern Ireland in a housing context about the rise in homelessness. It's been huge. There are far too many people who are living for far too long in temporary accommodation now. We have seen also in our owner-occupied sector, and people don't talk enough, but there are a lot of low-income households who have mortgages, who are struggling, who are impacted by interest rate changes. And then you see the pressure from both these parts of the market really pushing in on the private rented sector, where we know a lot of people are spending a lot of time, not by choice, but by necessity. They should be living in the social rented sector, where there are a lot more protections. And I was really struck, Ursula, when you were talking earlier about the idea of social security entitlement doing what it should do, because we know that in Northern Ireland, around 57% of those who are in receipt of local housing allowance, who are living in the private rented sector, don't get enough local housing allowance to pay the rent. And the average shortfall is around £98 per month. So there's a group of people for whom Social Security is not doing its job. That is creating pressure. And I think it's really important that I say that in the private rented sector, our work shows that when people don't have enough money for their rent, how that manifests in the private rented sector in particular is quite stark, because there are protections and protocols in social homes and in owner-occupied homes, and steps that your landlord or lender must follow before they can evict you for rent or for mortgage arrears. Those protections don't exist in the private rented sector, so there's a precarity. So people go without other things. They prioritise their rent payment, which means huge issues around poverty are sometimes masked in the private rented sector. I think it's also a really important piece in this report that we're drawing a red flag around in-work poverty. There's really interesting data that is regularly produced by Ulster University in relation to the private rented sector, which looks at the rental index and looks at earnings. And it's throwing out a number of red flags as well. It's saying that people on the lowest incomes are really struggling to pay the rent. But it's also saying that people on median incomes are also having huge affordability problems, because we've seen rents in the private rented sector skyrocket. So, for example, and I think this is quite stark, in the Belfast area alone, households on the lowest income are spending 49% of their income on the rent. So it's half of your household income on your rent if you're in the private rented sector. And all of this is all happening to a sector where there are less protections, less regulation in Northern Ireland than there are in other jurisdictions. So there is a precarity, there's a fragileness. And I think what we see in our work, and we have long been talking about the private rented sector, we've long been concerned about it, because although 17% of households in Northern Ireland live in the private rented sector, every day around 30 to 40% of the people who call our helpline are private renters. Their biggest issues are around affordability, but also around disrepair. And I think the two go hand in hand. If you can't afford your rent, you're not going to be putting your heating on. which is going to cause problems with dampness, you know, which is going to cause problems with colds and flus. And look at the news at the minute. So show me the child, and we know too many children are living in poverty in the private rented sector. Show me the child who does well in school whenever they're constantly off because they have flu and respiratory illnesses because of the damp and mold and cold in their homes. And I think the other thing that I would say in terms of how this changed with our work is, at Housing Rights, our core business is about preventing homelessness. We're an advice and an advocacy organisation, and we rely on the data that we have around where we can successfully prevent homelessness. And I really want to say that it is possible to prevent homelessness, and it is possible when the problem that is causing or threatening to cause homelessness is around affordability. It still is possible. We do have some safety nets. There are holes in quite a lot of them. But we do have some safety nets. There are ways that we can help people, and we always encourage people to come to us. But part of that work is also increasingly us looking at the data around where preventing homelessness has not been possible, where we thought that, yes, look, there's something here, we should be able to do something. And we're increasingly looking at why in those instances we weren't able to prevent homelessness. Sometimes it's because the household doesn't have access to a qualifying benefit, which would mean that they could access a discretionary housing payment. So there's a whole cohort of people for whom the safety net that exists doesn't apply to them. There are other people who should be able to access a discretionary housing payment, but they haven't been because they accessed one within the last 12 months. So there's also the idea that the safety nets that we have for people, a discretionary housing payment is a top-up payment that can help people who have a shortfall in their local housing allowance. And the idea there is that this system of top-up payments was created to provide a temporary solution to people, and now we're dealing with a permanent problem. So it's not helping people in that instance. But an increasing issue that we are seeing is around vulnerability. People who we should be able to help are disengaging from our support in a way that we're not able, they're not answering, they're not coming back to us, and that is a new trend in the private rented sector. So all of this is happening within a context, and I'm sure other service providers see this in their work. There's huge vulnerability, and people are for different reasons not able to access the support which might be able to help. And I think what that means for us as service providers, as people who are engaging with people on the ground, is that we need to change how we do our work. We need to intervene at an earlier stage. And that's something at Housing Rights that we're determined to do. So we are in talks at the minute with jobs and benefits offices about going out and doing housing clinics, because we want to get to people at an earlier stage, because we know that particularly around affordability, particularly around debt, all those issues, the psychology of reaching out for help is that people wait until it's almost too late before they reach out, and it's really hard. And I think with the multiple pressures that are weighing down on people at the minute, in health, in education, in housing, it's really, really hard for people to pluck up the courage to reach out and engage. So yes, Ursula resonates a lot.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And just hold some of those thoughts, because I think what I want to do, and I'll just go back the same way we started, is thinking about, so change is always possible. It is always possible. Thinking about the specific steps that you think, we've got 18 months left in this mandate, before there is another opportunity to think afresh. So thinking into that immediate space, just can I maybe ask Goretti, what do you see as being the next thing
That we need to do, or
that we need to do, that's called for, that would make a difference in that window,
in that
and then
window?
longer term?
Well, something about free school meals, I think, would make a big difference. That's something that families who are experiencing poverty tell us all the time that would make a big difference if there was more universal free school meals. Because at the moment, as we know, only the very poorest families have actually access to those. So that's something that's kind of like, you could imagine it's within our grasp. I have to say that what Kate was saying there really it challenged everything that we know, and this is happening across the region. Actually, certainly happening in areas much than Belfast, where the private rented sector has become like the main place that people get their accommodation, and it's very worrying. So the Life and Time survey, the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey, asks a question every year, which is really important that we should keep an eye on, I think, which is: did your household have to turn the heating down or off last winter, even though it was too cold, even though you needed it? And actually, in the last survey, that 2024 one, it was 42% of households had to do that. What's even more frightening is that 55% of households in the 24 to 35 age group, which is the age group when people have their children, have the youngest children, it was 55% who were turning the heating off or down. And that has a cost to society. So we know that the Northern Ireland Audit Office said that child poverty costs about £1 billion a year for Northern Ireland. An awful lot of that is in health issues, as in children, having asthma and all the things that you were talking about, Kate. And so I think that actually, like, I've been sort of thinking more about how do we persuade the folks on the Hill to actually take this seriously. And I think we need to start talking about those costs and need to start saying, look, this isn't a case of us saying, give us some free money here, or, give people some free money. We're saying, reduce your costs. If you're going to, because there's all this talk about what's going to happen with the health service, they're actually this child poverty is costing us, and we need to start like shouting that, I think, from the rooftops, and actually saying that they've got to find ways of putting some money into families' pockets so that children are not malnourished. And I don't mean that they're hungry, I mean they're malnourished. Do you know what I mean? You can feed a child, that doesn't mean that you give them nourishment and the heat. Because, well, we all know if you're cold and hungry, you're going to get sick. So she, Thank you. So I just think that's actually the main thing we need to do, is persuade the politicians that they need to do something and focus on kids.
Yeah, thank you. Lisa, there is the opportunity in a good jobs agenda, a good jobs bill.
Yeah. So,
or is there? What's your thoughts?
Well,
what's called for there?
Certainly, as I said, I think it's very clear that there's this situation now where work is not working. So we need to look at where it's going wrong. From an employment rights perspective, I would say where we're going wrong is that there are many jobs that are just not providing financial security. They're not stable jobs. And that calls for us to look at these, I suppose, really these 0 hours contracts that we see so frequently. And the good jobs bill, yes, there are proposals to move away from 0 hours contracts. There's the proposal for making banded hours contracts, so that anyone who is in a 0 hours contract situation, that they can then have an automatic entitlement to request what they call a banded hours contracts. But there are discussions around how long they would have to sort of be working in that 0 hours position before they can request that. I think the difficulty with that, I think it's certainly a step in the right direction, but I think there are still some issues with it, in that it's putting a lot of the onus on the employee to ask for this. What we find is actually that a lot of employees in that situation live in a sort of position of fear. They're scared to rock the boat with their employers, because they're just the employment is so precarious. It's so placing them in such a vulnerable position, and they feel that if they rock the boat, the hours will just be diminished. And from an employment rights perspective, there's not really, at the moment, there's not an awful lot you can do about that, because you've got someone who has signed a contract that's 0 hours. So I think certainly that's a step in the right direction to have these entitlement to banded hours, but I think it really needs to go further, in that there's nearly an automatic entitlement to some sort of contract if you have worked for even 12 weeks, for example, and you have a steady pattern of work. Why can there not be sort of an automatic entitlement that then that becomes the basis of your contract? Again, I would say with the the employment status, we really would you know, I think there are suggestions again via the Employment Rights Bill to look towards moving away from the 3-tier to a 2-tier, and I think we would really welcome that. I think that's something that is actually quite an urgent need at the moment, because we have people you know, who are either suspended from their employment or dismissed, and they're suspended without pay, or they're dismissed. They deem it to be an unfair dismissal. There's nowhere you can go if you are under the employment status of a worker as opposed to employee. So it's really sort of tipping all the favour in on the side of the employer, and the employee is sort of offering all of this flexibility, but getting nothing, you know, getting very little in return.
So there's a couple of very concrete examples that could come through in the short term.
Yeah.
In the context of that, good jobs.
I think another point to just was very interesting from the report is just about the idea of the remote working. What we also see coming through is, because obviously we're now 5 years on from the pandemic and sort of the initial introduction of all of the remote working, you have people who have secured employment which is based far away from home because they can do it remotely, and now we're seeing a real pretty quick shift at the moment towards this moving back to bringing everybody back into the office, so to speak, or to the workplace. And for some people, that's just completely unworkable. You know, we had a lady who had been in the employment for 3 years. She lived in Strabane. The workplace was in Belfast. It was a minimum wage, low paid job. That's entirely unworkable, apart from, you know, it being impracticable. Financially, that's just not sustainable. So, and we're seeing quite a lot of that. So I think that's something that it's great to see that highlighted in the report, and something that really needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Lisa. And finally then, Kate, before we come into the room, one of the things that I was really struck by in the findings, when Christine dug into all of this, was just the I mean, we all know it, you know, greater reliance on the private rented sector, and that's a reflection of what's happened in the social housing space over many years. But when you see the escalating costs in the private rented sector, I mean, I really get me pause. So, you know, in terms of housing, and why housing is so important for everyone to have that safe, warm, affordable home, as a protective factor against poverty, and looking at 3 in 10 people private renters being dragged into poverty because of housing costs. What do you see next?
I think there is a really important piece about strengthening the safety nets. You know, social housing as a safety net, at least it's designed to be, and we have very modest social housing targets that we're not meeting. I think we should be encouraging government to continue to resource that and to amp up the resourcing of it. Some of our social security measures that are designed to support people there aren't working as they should be, and I think we need to continue to call that out. I think I take heart in Northern Ireland that we have been able to mitigate, and I think that is a message we should continue to champion, that change is possible. The work of the Cliff Age Coalition, the work of others, is a really important piece here. There's really good pragmatic proposals that haven't been taken forward. Some of them require legislative change, but some of them don't. And particularly in the private rented sector, the recommendation from the independent review panel doesn't require legislative change. So that is a pragmatic piece that can and should be taken forward.
Just for people who don't know what that is.
Yes, so
briefly what that is.
Yeah, so it is about providing access to support for private renters who have this shortfall. And who have access to discretionary housing payment, and who maybe have other issues. What it would do would be to provide financial capability, financial inclusion support, and also provide access to an additional payment over and above. So it was quite well thought out. It was costed. It's included in the review panel recommendations. So there are processes and systems and proposals that have been thought through and are included and are sitting on a shelf. And so I think that's really important. I think there is a piece, and Greta mentioned it earlier, about the views and experiences of people with lived experience. I think one of the things that we're really, really good at in the community and voluntary sector is listening and utilising the experience of people who know about this. And I suppose I'm particularly struck that poverty is such an undignified experience, and that in involving people, doing it well, paying them for their expertise, removing barriers to participation, we're restoring a little bit of dignity in that process. So I think there's a piece about innovating, using the insights from people who have lived experience, because very often in my experience, actually the things that need to change, some of them are big and structural, but some of them are very pragmatic, very practical and very necessary, and where there's will and where you do it well. And I think all of that can be supported by insights from data. So we have been doing quite a lot of that work in terms of our service design and housing rights, and it makes good business sense, but it's also the right thing to do. And I think the third thing, and I know, Ursula, you want us to be positive and to lean into our optimism. In Northern Ireland, we now have a programme for government. We haven't had one in quite a long time. That's good. Hopefully we're going to move to a position where we have another programme for government that is over a longer period. How can we build towards that? We're going to move, hopefully, to a position, we're told, where we have multi-year budgets. How can we move towards that? I think there's a piece about taking a strategic policy view here and saying, where do we want to be in 10 years? What's our vision? And how are we going to get there? And I think there's a piece for us as a sector, and I suppose I reflect quite a lot on the experience within the Cliff Edge Coalition, because one of the things the policymakers told us there was that it was so helpful in this quagmire of things that needed to be changed to have a unified voice from the sector saying, do this, do these things. And that's one of the things that's so helpful about the JRF report, because it's saying, here's something, we've modelled it, we've costed it, do this, it'll make a change. So I think there's a piece for us about coming together around changes and bringing that diverse experience and in behind it, and saying, right, okay, we're going to bank the changes that we've got and we're going to move towards a better position.
Thank you very much. So thanks to all of you for now. I'm going to move into the room. Colleagues will keep an eye online for us. But just to open this to the floor, I mean, much of what you've heard is I mean, Kate, for example, just talked about the importance of people with direct experience. Saying, actually, this is what's needed. And I know many of you are working in that space as well. So just want to open up to the floor right now. There is a roving mic. I'm looking now, yes, furiously at the back of the room. Or is there a roving mic? There is. There is. Does anyone want to kick off the question or an observation? Mary. Real living wage.
Yes, my name is Mary McManus and I'm the Regional Manager for Living Wage NI. So I just want to raise that the living wage is something that can be done now. Mm-hmm. There's two of us working to try and increase the number of people getting a living wage in Northern Ireland, and we could do with all your support to help us with that. The living wage went up on October 22nd. It's currently worth £2,418 more per year than the national living wage, and that's worth 7 months of food shopping or 4 months of spending on housing and energy and fuel for a household. When the national living wage goes up in 2026 to £12.71 per hour, the real living wage is still worth £1,440 per year more, which is 4 months worth of food for a household or 2 months spending on housing, energy and fuel, or over a year's spending on fuel. So that's a really concrete difference. There's 17%. I was interested in your stat about the 45% who didn't get a living wage in the last 5 years, but currently we have 17%, so 1 in 6 workers are paid below the living wage here, and that's the second highest rate in the UK. Living Wage NI is a franchise of the Living Wage Foundation in London, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a principal partner in that. And we've got going so late here on this. This is something we can really do about in-work poverty. It's not something, the Northern Ireland Executive are already accredited as a living wage employer, and anyone tendering for a public sector contract has to pay the living wage as part of that. But this is something that organisations can do now. They can get signed up as living wage employers and lend their support and help us to grow the movement here. Scotland got going, Living Wage Scotland got going in 2014. There's now 4,000 living wage employers in Scotland, and they have, I don't know if it's the lowest this year because I haven't seen all the data for each area yet, but they had the lowest number of jobs paid below the living wage last year. And 25% of the 16,000 odd living wage employers in the UK are in Scotland. So they're really punching above their weight on this. Kind of forgot what I was going to say now. Oh yeah, just this. The living wage movement got going 24 years ago. It's contributed almost 500,000 workers have got a pay rise as a result of the living wage movement. And it's had an upwards pressure on the government minimum wage rates as well. And just to say, not only the Living Wage Foundation have also developed a living hours accreditation. As yet, no organisation in Northern Ireland has signed up for that, but that's to do something about 0-hour contracts. And there's also a living pension accreditation, which is the newest accreditation from the foundation. There's no business signed up as a living wage, as a living pension employer, but that's doing something about in-work poverty, post-work poverty. So we've got 199 employers signed up as living wage employers in Northern Ireland, and the second highest rate of jobs paid below the living wage. So I would just encourage you all to, if your business or your organisation is not currently signed up as a living wage employer, to get signed up and to help us with that, to grow the movement here. And the accreditation doesn't just cover directly employed staff, it also covers indirect, which makes it robust. So it helps us to try and get all the public sector signed up, more private sector signed up, and to just take action now on in-work poverty.
Thanks, Mary. And Christine did highlight the modelling that was done in relation to the impact of the real living wage. So hopefully that is of value in terms of making the case that we can do something about work.
Can I just respond to that?
Yes, please do, Christine.
I think really, the thing about poverty and why it is such a difficult thing is because it underscores everything, and life expectancy and health and education, and there's so many parts and contributing factors. And so although the modelling shows that moving everyone onto the real living wage would have a lesser effect, I don't want that to get lost in a lesser effect compared to the child payment. But it's part of the solution, It's definitely model it alongside structural reforms, childcare reform, for example. These things together would make a massive difference. And I guess the messaging from the report is just, sometimes we do feel a bit stuck in Northern Ireland. So what's the first step? And then what's the next step? And what's the next step? So I think I just want to make sure that everybody knows that is definitely absolutely part of, the solution to this problem.
Thanks, Christine.
People are in work poverty or not, where it's not about the children as well.
So I've got no questions in the room, but just for a bit of balance here, I'm really getting a big wave from my colleagues in the corner. I think something online that they want to put into the panel.
Thanks, Ursula. Yeah, just quite a few questions. This is probably for Christine. In terms of the data issues, obviously in agriculture and around ethnic minorities or global majorities, really looking at what can we do about that, and what's maybe the long-term plan, and ensuring there's better data linkages and better sources that we can get the information we need.
Actually, I think that's really important. It's I have become totally passionate about data. I always was, but now I love it more than I ever did. And I was really shocked with the conversation that Christine and Shane and I had around some of the data challenges. So this is something that JRF really does want to put its weight behind it in Northern Ireland. Christine will be leading the charge on that.
Sum it up. I mean, there's lots and lots of different kind of parts to the answer. The first is that surveys that we're relying on, like the Family Resource Survey, they just won't have the sample size in Northern Ireland, particularly for minority ethnic groups. that means in practice that you're kind of aggregating to a white, non-white, or, you know, very, very kind of broad categories that really tell you very little about what those people are actually experiencing, or, you know, what could be causing their particular, you know, the specifics of their situation. The other kind of source that we have to rely on is the census. But it doesn't collect any information about income. So in terms of measuring poverty, you know, there's very little we can do. We can look at kind of multiple deprivation indicators, or, you know, other ways of like looking at the problem. But again, it's just not directly comparable to any of our, you know, measures that we would be using for the white population here. So, and I mean, there's a lot of work going on in Northern Ireland to try and kind of make use of the administrative data sets that we have in Northern Ireland. These data sets that already exist, that are kind of just routinely collected. And so there's a real opportunity there, and to kind of link these different data sets, you know, the census, FRS, and administrative data sets, and ADRC are doing a lot of work in that area, and it's something that, you know, Joseph Rowntree Foundation are also going to be.
And for those who don't know, that's the Administrative Data Research Centre, which is a coalition between Queen's University Belfast, Ulster University, and a number of organisations working in the sector. And, you know, why is that data so important? Because that's fundamentally what is the backbone for driving change and driving policy. And so that matters hugely. I'm going to come back, if I can, now into the room, because there are 3 questions. I'm going to start. I'll start, Greta, over here. Or
hello, Greta Gurklita from Disability Action. I just wanted to maybe add something about the cost of living and disability and disabled people living in poverty. Disabled people feel like they are under attack by government. The first thing it was the I suppose were suggested personal independent payment, you know, changes where if you do not have like 4 points in a daily living activity, you do not get PIP at all. Like there no reward for daily living activity. So for people who have like fluctuating conditions, or maybe have conditions that are going to deteriorate, and I'm going to speak from my own lived experience. I have multiple sclerosis. Last time when I was awarded PIP, I did not scored 4 points on any activity. So now if the changes would come in, I would not get PIP just because I don't have 4 points. So disabled people are really worried about that. And we challenged and we spoke to Minister Timms, and thank goodness that government actually been back on it. But another thing was mobility scheme and the cars. So we got in Disability Action, we get more and more phone calls from people saying government's doing that, what's next? Because like it's constant. Another thing is about, we all know that it costs more expensive to live with disability than without, you know, because sometimes you cannot cook food for yourself, you cannot walk, you need to get a taxi and things like that. And that is, I think that last research showed that it's about £1,000 more to live with a disability a month. Next point would be about disability employment strategy that is now under consultation. The problem is that government has these schemes, for example, Workable NI, Access to Work NI, that would help, and we have condition management program. How many people, even in the room or online, knows about these programs that would be really helpful for people to sustain employment? Not many know, and government doesn't advertise, because what would happen? A system would crash. if it would be like, if every single disabled person who wants to be in employment would approach the DFC and say, I need that support, or I need a taxi to work instead of bus, or I need a support worker. Government cannot afford it, so system would crash, and so that's difficult. And then the last thing is, in disability action, we are running few kind of like supports, like we do social supermarkets in Belfast City Council when we are offering food vouchers. These, like, we have limited number, but the amount of people are contacting us for support, it's extremely high, and we are covering just Belfast. But we also this year, like it's third year now, when we are administrating the Bryson Energy Support Scheme. And this year, like usually we get like about 50 application forms, and sometimes we don't know because it's not advertised and we don't know if we will use all. This year we asked for 100 application forms, and they are like, people are contacting us constantly. We never before saw that kind of, like demand for help, because we are trying to help disabled people, disabled communities. So yeah, so life for a disabled person is hard.
Which is kind of resonating with
yes,
what
what
you
I
heard.
said, and
Yeah.
our unemployment rate is the highest in UK.
Yes, it is.
So and disabled people, like just in general, we feel that they are under attack.
I think that message of overlooked is one that many of us in the room and online have heard, and it's a really important to pay attention to that. The disability employment gap in Northern Ireland has been far too high for far too long. We highlight that in the report. That is something that is, again, more change is possible. So thanks for bringing that into the room. To make my colleagues' life much easier, I'm going to ask you to come here next and then here, okay?
Fiona Cole from Trussell. I have 1,000 things I could ask, but thank you, Ursula.
We haven't done that long.
No, I think I'll do specifically. Obviously, we have a great partnership, and something Kate, you said is about if you're hungry and if you're cold, Greta, you mentioned that as well, then you can't function properly in society. So I think really where we're seeing is 520,000 people at the moment in Northern Ireland are food insecure. That's a significant 1 in 3 children live in food insecure households. I really feel when you're talking about hope, Ursula, that if we could fix the fundamentals of making sure people have a safe, affordable, warm home with food, that's where we can set a foundation and an infrastructure. It's really just to add a few things of, again, it's the upstream support. Yes, it's more expensive. Yes, it's more time consuming, but you actually can save people. We know that income maximisation could do a huge amount, saving somebody from losing their home before having to get temporary accommodation because they're homeless. My question to the panel is, we work understanding that we work in a person-centred environment where we see people with lived experience and we integrate that information and data and present it. How would you see that we should be doing more to get that received? Because I feel like we want to be able to help the government, and David's here, not to put him on the spot. We're all here to work for the people we support, including government. And it's just that, how do we use the next 18 months to really coalesce that information so it's not just NISRA stats? Because as you said, statistics doesn't actually tell the full story. So
it's a really good question about story. But just panel, hold on a second. I'm just going to there's another question just just here. I'm watching our time in relation to our online. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anne Spelling from the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group. And I just kind of wanted to get the panel's thoughts, kind of following on from what Fiona was talking about, story and narrative. When the Chancellor announced the two-child limit, scrapping of the two-child limit, which was fantastic news, but really, really overdue. I don't have the exact language, but she'd kind of said that it's not the fault of the children, so they shouldn't be punishing the children. And there was a real narrative of it's not the children's fault, but kind of unspoken that it's the parents' fault, which this just further stigmatizes poverty. And I think that while it was a really positive and something that's so welcome, scrapping the two-child limit, I do think it almost makes it difficult then to go further with scrapping other welfare reform from the austerity period, such as the benefit cap, such as bedroom tax, because those, yes, obviously impact on children's poverty, but are seen more of as more to do with adults, I suppose. And I think what was, brilliant that others have mentioned it as well, that, the bit that work doesn't really work, especially not in the gendered nature of poverty within the report. So like if a child goes cold and hungry, it's often that, the parent or often the mother goes cold and hungry first. So I suppose, how do we keep the pressure on tackling not only just child poverty, but, looking at poverty as a whole and not at the expense of the adults, because I feel that the focus of child poverty as in the UK government, I suppose, but even here is again almost a dig at parents and adults that are in poverty sometimes. And I'm thinking particularly women, obviously Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, particularly women, majority of lone parents, which was noted in the report as being more likely to be in poverty, and majority of low paid part-time workers. So I think was welcoming the two-child limit scrapping, but I'm still really concerned at the narrative coming out of the government. So that's your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. And there will be, I suppose we're all anticipating a UK government child poverty strategy over the next weeks. I'm not sure when that's going to finally land, but well, okay. Yes. So, that will be really important as well for us to look at in the context of the interaction between the UK government's child poverty strategy and ultimately what emerges from the executive in relation to our own anti-poverty strategy. So there's a thread in both of those questions to the panel, which is essentially around narrative shifting and grounding that in people's direct experience. Kate, can I start with you?
Yes, two really interesting questions. I think that the piece around narrative shifting is a really important one, and I know that the Voluntary Foundation and others are doing really great work around this. And one of the things that I find most helpful in it is that it's really important to be solution focused, because there's a particular idea about poverty, and it's quite pervasive, and it appears in homelessness as well, that it's just too broken and too big to fix. And I think we have to be really specific about what the solutions are, because there are solutions, and this conversation is really helpful in that. And the idea of using story and people with lived experience, putting them front and centre. All of us have a megaphone. All of us have access to people with power. It's one of the things in Northern Ireland. It's quite a small government. You can get a meeting with the minister. You can get a meeting with senior officials. It's great that we have officials here. So I think that piece is really important, and continuing to do that. But I was really struck earlier in the week, on Monday evening, I was at an event in Italy, which was to launch a new programme called New Foundations. And it's an initiative that's been brought forward by the Housing Executive, the Department for Health, and the Department for Communities. And really what it's about is about upstream intervention for young people who are leaving care, who end up becoming homeless. And the idea was that we know these young people are going to be leaving care. We know they're going to be presenting as homeless. Why don't we do something to intervene at an earlier stage? And one of the reasons why I found it particularly interesting, because you could really say, well, there's whole cohorts of young people more broadly that we know will probably enter the homelessness system. Why don't we target all of them? But I suppose the strategic idea behind it is that if you target one group within that and you show what's possible, so don't wait to try and fix the whole system, fix a particular part of the system and use that as evidence then about what's possible, because prevention and upstream intervention costs less. Yes, it means you have to pony up at an early stage in the process rather than waiting to treat the more expensive version of the problem. But I think that message about identifying change and going at it and showing the evidence of what's working then builds strategic leverage for being able to tackle something. So yes, there are big structural problems and we shouldn't take our eye off them, but there's also a piece about looking at problems in a very focused, strategic, well, what can we do? I'm quite a pragmatic person, so which part of this problem can we fix today? And let's go for that.
Thanks, Kate. And I think I now have to say goodbye to all of our colleagues online, but that's exactly why we wanted to look at what immediate gains would flow from a targeted child payment at low-income families in Northern Ireland right now. And we know, and we've seen the modelling shows us the difference that will make. So there is a real opportunity to move on those next steps in that. I do have to say goodbye to everybody who's joined us online. Thank you for joining us. It's didn't get to see you, but I hope you all enjoyed this morning's event. Please have a look at the report and, you know, come talk to us. We're really easy to find. Just get our emails from the JRF website, drop us a line. We want to hear from you. We want to take your feedback. You know, do reach out and get in touch. Thank you so much and have a great Christmas. And that's the first time I've said that. Thanks, everybody.